Good afternoon. Oh, sorry. Good afternoon. My name is Marianne Rodriguez, and I'm a program associate with the Capitol Hill campus at the Mercatus Center. For those of you who are unfamiliar with the Mercatus Center, we are an educational outreach facility affiliated with the George Mason University, and we seek to provide policymakers with academic resources to assist them in discussing pressing issues. This week we are presenting Economic Thinking Outside the Box to address some of the more atypical subjects. Tomorrow I'd like to remind you that Dr. Alex Tabarrok will present a lecture on solutions to organ donations shortages. So we would love it if you would join us for that as well. As a side note, I would like to call your attention to the green feedback forms that you find on the table in front of you. If you could take a moment to fill these out before you go, that would be great, because we do look at these to help us continually improve our programs. With us today is Dr. Larry Iannaccone to present on radical religion and the market for martyrs. Dr. Iannaccone is a professor at George Mason University, and he is also the director of the Center for the Economic Study of Religion. As a leading scholar on this issue, his work has appeared in the American Economic Review, the Journal of Economic Literature, and the Journal of for the Scientific Study of Religion. So without further delay, please join me in welcoming Dr. Larry Iannaccone.
Thank you very much. So we're on here. Okay. Well, greetings. It's a great pleasure to be here. I warned them that, and I'll warn you, that there will be no PowerPoint. We're talking about religion. I'm preaching. Let me start by saying that it's been quite some time now since September 11. We've all learned a variety of things, many of them quite sobering. We all know a good deal more about religiously oriented terrorism and suicide bombing in particular than we knew back then. Let me remind you of some of the things that we thought we knew, and for all I know, some of you still think you know, about religious terrorism, radical Islam in particular, suicide bombing maybe in particular. In the wake of September 11, people were quick to conclude that this must be the work of folks who are deranged, crazy, irrational, or brainwashed, coerced, or hate-filled, profoundly anti-American, anti-Western, or desperately poor, alienated, hopeless, people with nothing to live for. After all, we saw dozens of people giving up their lives, and since then, scores of people killing themselves, apparently willingly, merely to inflict harm on others. What kind of people would do this? Ignorant people, crazy people, people who were easily misled, people who were easily manipulated, people who were profoundly and deeply attached to some theology that promised them extraordinary afterlife rewards if they inflicted great harm on others. You can go on at great length. The point is that all of these perspectives emphasize at some level the irrationality of the actors, or if not the outright irrationality, the pathological, the deviant, the very different character of their perspective, their world, their upbringing. And I must say that even back then, my initial reaction as someone who had spent many years studying the sociology of religion and working in a now growing field known as the economics of religion, my initial reaction was, no, there's something fundamentally wrong with these portraits. And I want to tell you today, I want to give you today a rather different portrait, one that we now have, there's a kind of sense in which this is a retrospective on what started out as very speculative thoughts and now have been confirmed by a great deal of research. Some ideas about what's really going on here, and in particular, in keeping with Mercatus's overall orientation, I'm giving you what is an academic and theoretical perspective rather than a case-oriented one. For nearly 25 years, I've been studying religion by combining insights from perspectives of economics and sociology, and of course also religious studies. And throughout those years, I've been especially interested in religious extremism, both good and bad, benign and deadly. Today I want to talk about ways in which this social economic paradigm helps us understand why and where and when violent extremism develops, how it's sustained, why it's so difficult to defeat, and why, despite all of that, it arises so rarely. And what I want to do is sort of come at this subject from three different disciplines. I want to give you a quick review of insights that have been gleaned from the sociology of religion, then switch to the economics of religion, and finally to what I call the market for martyrs, and conclude with some statements about the advantages that religious groups have when it comes to militancy and suicide bombing, why, despite these advantages, we actually see remarkably little, this may seem like a strange statement, but remarkably little violence within religious groups. And of course, at the end, I'll say a little bit about policy-oriented observations about ways to deter and disrupt religious militancy. The background for this talk is a series of papers and research that I've co-authored with a few people. Rodney Stark, who's a very well-known sociologist of religion, Roger Finke, another sociologist of religion, and Ellie Berman, another economist. And there are going to be various themes that I'll keep returning to in one form or another. I might as well just state them now. Two of them deserve special merit. First, academics, journalists, governing officials can best understand religious commitment, even its most extreme and pernicious manifestations, by viewing it as rational, normal, reasonable behavior. I want to emphasize that. So we want to start, I'm going to claim, by not assuming that these people are crazy, whoever these people are, and no matter whether we're talking about Jehovah's Witnesses at your door, or the Amish over in parts of Pennsylvania, or suicide bombers, start with the assumption that these people are somehow operating within a rational framework. Second, the effects of government intervention are, if anything, more pernicious in the realm of religion than in the realm of commerce. To label religious extremism as the product of ignorance, coercion, psychopathology is to foster misunderstanding. To combat extremism in general, as opposed to just extreme violence. To combat extremism as a whole with the powers of the state is to invite conflict. And to support good religion, what we think of as good religion, while trying to repress bad religion is a great way to foster and create more violence. So let me start. I'll get back to those themes, as I say, as we go. But let me start with some lessons from the sociology of religion. Thanks to sociological studies from the 1960s, 70s, 80s, we know a tremendous amount about extreme religious groups that aren't particularly violent. Groups that we call cults and sects. And what we've learned, especially, is that extreme groups, I could say deviant groups, of all kinds display rather similar attributes, experience similar problems, and adopt similar strategies to maintain commitment and grow. Now, you might be saying, okay, fine, whatever it is you have to say about cults, that's not really my interest here. My interest is radical Islam. My interest is suicide bombing. Americans, in particular, no longer obsess about the Moonies and transcendental meditation and the Hare Krishnas and the children of God. It's all rather quaint. But I'm struck by how many of today's debates and concerns mirror those of debates about the cults in the 1970s. And even the contemporary discussion about suicide bombing mirrors worries that we had. And I want to remind you, especially for those of you who are younger, that back in the 1970s, people really did think that these cults were explosive, were growing explosively, extremely dangerous, were kidnapping young people, these were the claims, were brainwashing people, and after the Jim Jones massacre in Guyana, it was not far-fetched to say that they were killing hundreds, if not thousands of people. So let me summarize some of the findings that come out of the cult literature, findings that, in my opinion, carry over to deviant cults carry over from deviant cults to militant religious groups that perpetrate acts of terror. Number one, the typical cult recruit is normal in nearly all respects, economically, socially, psychologically. Typical cult converts, and we have scores of studies at every level, from surveys to participant observation studies where people became involved in cults, and carefully kept track of things. Typical cult converts are not plagued by neurotic fears, repressed anger, high anxiety, religious obsession, personality disorders, deviant needs, and other mental pathologies. They are remarkably normal when you give them standard psychological profiles. Typical converts, whether it was to the Moonies or Hare Krishnas or whatever group that you think is particularly weird today, typical converts are not alienated, frustrated in their relationships, or lacking in social skills. Typical converts are young, healthy, intelligent, and they actually average better than normal backgrounds, economic and social and educational backgrounds and prospects. Conversion, let me give you another set of findings. Conversion to deviant religious groups rarely occurs unless the recruit develops stronger attachment to members in the group than non-members. This is what is sometimes known as the social network theory of conversion. The traditional theories of conversion kind of took the story of Paul on the road to Damascus as the paradigm. Paul sort of riding down the road to Damascus, knows where he stands, knows what he's for, and what he's for is killing off Christians, and then suddenly, wham! He's knocked off his horse, his whole worldview changes, and suddenly he becomes a Christian. Okay, now, I'm not going to question whether or not this happened to Paul, but I will tell you it very, very, very rarely happens to anyone else. Okay? Conversion is almost always a social process first, an intellectual process second. And it is remarkable how many people, when you go and interview them and sort of get them alone and relaxed, will tell you that, yeah, well, I'm part of the Moonies here. I'm really not sure whether Reverend Moon, is divine. I really don't know whether I believe all of this, but I love these people. They love me. I've never felt so, so fulfilled. One guy who, one of my colleagues and co-authors, Rodney Stark, interviewed, put it this way. He said, look, I don't know whether, in fact, Reverend Moon is what he claims to be, but I got to tell you this. If he is, I'm on the ground floor of the greatest event in human history, and if not, I was just working in a plywood box factory anyway. This is sort of the ultimate Pascal's wager. It's like you attach the different probabilities to. Look, what is it that tips people to join cults and get incredibly involved? It's social ties. And the kind of people who form those social ties most readily with members of some new cult are people who have relatively weak ties already. Now, that doesn't mean they're crazy. People with relatively weak ties that I'm thinking about and that we observe in the literature tend to be young people, single people, people who are in colleges and away from home, people who have not yet started a family. So the opposite, the people who you almost never manage to recruit successfully to extreme groups, deviant groups, and again, I'm talking primarily about the literature from the 1970s, not primarily talking about terrorism yet. The people you recruit most successfully are all of these things, and they're the opposite of what? Well, people who are married, with children, homeowners, well-established in their careers, in their neighborhood. Those are the kind of people who show up, say, this is very interesting stuff, and then go home and go back to work, Groups tend to grow through pre-existing social networks. So the best way to make a series of converts is to make, well, one, and then, usually through some existing tie, a friend or family member, and then reach out to their friends and family members. And all you have to do is talk to successful groups, the Mormons, Jehovah's Witnesses, other, mainstream religious groups, and find, it's basically written in their manuals. Okay? State it negatively. Social barriers, whether they're economic, regional, ethnic, language, religious, they tend to block recruitment. So it's very hard for a group that starts primarily among Protestants to make a lot of headway among Catholics, let alone Jews. And it's hard for a group that's primarily Hispanic to reach over to blacks or to whites, and so on. Recruitment is a process involving repeated social interactions, and recruits participate extensively and intentionally in their own conversions. This again gets to this point of rationality. Conversion is almost always incremental, opposite of Paul on the road to Damascus. Some behavioral changes may be very, very sudden. People might suddenly join a group just the way you might suddenly get involved in, well, on the one hand, a summer camp, or on the other hand, an internship. I understand that it's quite cult-like over at Mercatus. The glassy-eyed drones who've just introduced me. No, quite seriously, you take on a new role and your behavior can change quite radically, but that doesn't mean your worldview suddenly changes quite radically. You know, so who knows about these folks at Mercatus? They might even vote Democratic occasionally. You know, I mean, and likewise, I've heard that there are some you know, academics who, when no one's looking, vote Republican. The overt, obvious behavior is rarely a good indication of what's going on in people's minds. Another way of saying this is that high levels of involvement and sacrifice can coexist with doubt and uncertainty and a high probability of defection. In fact, when you looked at the Moonies, who were seen as the ultimate cult of the mind control, brainwashing cult of the 1970s, it turned out that defection occurred at every stage of the process. People who joined or got involved, half of them tended to leave within a few days, half of the rest, you know, left within a week or a month, more of those left after a year. The total defection rate was somewhere between 95 and 99% of the people who initially got involved. This is not what we call effective brainwashing, you know. You're losing almost everyone. Intensity of commitment is not synonymous with certainty of belief, stability of attachment, and those who leave cults after weeks, months, even years of membership have little difficulty returning to normal activities, beliefs, and relationships. If they were thoroughly brainwashed, if they were pathological to begin with, if they were, you know, demented, you wouldn't expect this kind of normal behavior after the you know, episode to happen. And by the way, these high rates of defection that I'm talking about aren't just characterizing the religious groups of the 1970s that you may have heard about. It's characteristic of all kinds of very intense groups, even organized crime, even mafia, even violent gangs. Defection rates are much higher than you realize, and as long as the people who defect don't cause trouble for those who are left, they tend to be not given any trouble themselves. Now look, the point of all of this is that these insights carry over to militant religious radicals. And whereas back, you know, in the immediate aftermath of 9/11, I found myself arguing this to people who thought I was just plain crazy, now we've got a fair amount of evidence to back up the notion that this analogy that I'm making is real and appropriate. We now know that most religious radicals are neither desperate, nor poor, nor ignorant, nor mentally unstable, and they certainly haven't been brainwashed against their will. As with the cult converts of the 1970s, suicide bombers and other militant extremists are typically recruited through existing social networks. And the intensity of commitment is much more a product of special social dynamics than some kind of deviant psychology on the part of these people. If you want to understand where commitment comes from, look to the interaction process rather than something bizarre going on inside the mind, and even less, something bizarre that predated involvement. As a result, some of the best work now on identifying and identifying members of terrorist organizations and preventing outbreaks of violence comes through social network analysis. Mark Sageman, in particular, has done terrific work on terror networks. And the underlying, if you read his book on understanding terror networks, the one place where you encounter some theory as opposed to lots of very good empirical analysis is theory of the sociology of religion, quoting some of the same people I just mentioned, Rodney Stark and Bill Bainbridge in particular. So what does this mean? As a matter of policy, the literature suggests some fairly straightforward strategies for addressing or at least understanding religious radicalism. Strategy number one, rather than continue to rediscover prior insights in a hit or miss fashion, rather than trying to reinvent the wheel, we should be deliberately and extensively mining the large literature on cults for insights, predictions, theories that are relevant to religious militancy. We should resist the temptation to say, well, Jehovah's Witnesses, Mormons, Moonies, and I'm not conflating these groups, like they're all equivalent, but religious, the Amish, the Hare Krishnas, they have interesting stories, but they have nothing to tell us about these wackos or in the Middle East. And by the way, I have this tendency to be rather glib and in the process offend almost everybody. Do not read too much into my language here or my enthusiasm for this subject. And if you're wondering, like, what kind of person could do this sort of thing for a living, I will tell you that I happen to be personally quite religious. But doing good social science means being, in some sense, methodologically atheistic. That means I don't wake up in the morning, saying, assume the non-existence of God, but I do, when I do my studies, say, okay, what does social science tell us? And kind of let the chips fall. I find it remarkable that when the chips do fall, they tend not to be nearly so scary as many religious people might think. But as I say, take some of what I say, as my mother used to say, with a large box of salt. Okay, so we should be carrying over these insights. And, it's cheap. It's a lot cheaper to go find some dusty academic or the dusty book that the academic wrote about the Moonies than it is to get yourself involved in a suicide bombing group, okay? And although you ultimately need to look at the phenomenon itself, it's nice if you can make a lot of headway before you find, yourself strapping bombs, onto yourself or trying to, go underground in extremely dangerous groups. Secondly, agencies seeking to identify potential suicide bombers and bomber cells need to put more emphasis on social profiling than psychological or economic profiling. And as I say, this is one of the lessons that, as far as I can tell, intelligence agencies really have begun to learn. Mark Sageman, as I mentioned, is one of the key people outside of government now who's pushed this perspective and very effectively. Number three, agencies should do everything they can to exploit the high rates of doubt, disillusionment, and defection that almost certainly prevail within radical religious groups. And I don't, sad to say, have a lot of direct evidence for this last statement. We have remarkably little good work on defection from extremist groups for a variety of reasons, and not just because it's hard to interview people who've blown themselves up. But everything we know about religious extremism suggests that there are people defecting, or at least defect may be too strong of a word, leaving, at all sorts of stages. They're just sort of becoming a part of, Islamic culture, saying this is not for me. We need to, I think, to do more work based on the assumption that disillusionment, disengagement, switching away from religious extremism happens all the time, especially as people age and marry and develop careers and raise family and move locations and switch their social ties. Everything we know from other literature suggests this is pervasive, and I don't think that we've exploited this fact very much at all. Now, that's all sort of insights from sociology of religion. I'm going to switch gears now, go to economics of religion. And let me say, by way of introduction to switching gears, that when I say economics of religion, I'm talking about the economic perspective that emphasizes rational choice, cost-benefit thinking, the economic perspective that assumes that when people change their behavior, it's because something has changed, usually in terms of the relative prices and costs, rather than some kind of psychological change in their preferences. So as Gary Becker, the Nobel laureate, says, the economic approach, the heart of the economic approach are the assumptions of maximizing behavior, stable preferences, and market equilibrium applied relentlessly and unflinchingly. So I will attempt not to flinch. It's not all about money. It's not about commerce primarily. If you came here expecting me to be talking about, Islamic pay scales, and retirement options for imams, or the suicide bombers who somehow don't die along the way, this is not what I'm talking about. I'm not talking about the financing of Al-Qaeda. These are important issues, but that's not the economic part that I'm dealing with. Okay, I'm dealing with this economic perspective. And my central claim is simply this: suicide bombing and other forms of violent religious extremism can be viewed as a market phenomenon grounded in carefully planned exchanges between a relatively small supply of people who are willing to sacrifice themselves and a relatively large number of demanders, quote unquote, who benefit from the sacrificers' acts. Now, unfortunately, these transactions are not like me buying, a taco or a burrito at Taco Bell. These are transactions that impose terrific costs on third parties, these externalities, and so I can't just say, well, it's a transaction, let the market work. Adam Smith says markets are efficient, so if this is a market for martyrs, it must be efficient. No, that's not what I'm saying at all. But the insights of market economics are terrifically valuable. If you want to think about a market that's comparable, think about markets for radioactive waste. They have real costs that are imposed on other people. If I decide to store radioactive waste in my backyard, you living next to me obviously have something to say about it, whereas if I'm eating burritos, presumably you don't. The supply side of this market are the militant religious groups who are, in effect, the firms in the business of producing acts of violence in exchange for benefits both material and social. The leaders of these groups are, in effect, managers and employers insofar as they recruit, they train, they supervise the supply of sometimes suicidal labor that constitutes the key input of these firms' violent outputs, input-output management. Outside customers and investors are the people who value these outcomes and are the primary sources of funds required to operate the business. Now, you'd think that finding people willing to work in this line of business would be a huge managerial challenge. In fact, everyone almost thinks of labor supply as the biggest problem and central puzzle of suicide bombing. And after all, people are killing themselves. This view mistakes the situation, focuses on the wrong side of the market, and I think suggests the wrong strategies for deterrence. And let me state this more clearly. However strange and pathological it seems for somebody to be willing to kill themselves for whatever the cause is, focusing on that as though that's the central problem for these firms, as I'm calling them, is wrong. And let me explain why. If you focus on that, you focus on what you might call supply-side strategies. We've got to cut off the supply of suicide bombers. And it's misguided and ineffective to take that approach for a variety of reasons. Number one, terrorist firms can function effectively even if the supply of suicide killers is extremely small. Even a very few successful suicide bombings cause widespread terror. Total up the numbers. The total number of people who have killed themselves in suicide bombings, even now in Iraq, where it's become relatively normal, but especially if you set aside Iraq, where it's so obviously part of a military strategy, the total number is extraordinarily small. We're talking about dozens, at most hundreds of people. These are minuscule numbers compared to the number of people who routinely die in normal military actions, let alone major wars. You need only a tiny supply of people to maintain this market and cause widespread terror. Number two, standard criminal penalties such as fines, imprisonment, execution are going to have, it's almost funny to say it, minimal impact on the expected costs and benefits confronting a rational suicide bomber. And they're going to have even less impact on an irrational suicide bomber. Telling somebody, don't blow yourself up or I'm going to catch you and throw you in jail for the rest of your life is not a very effective way of stopping somebody who is willing to kill himself. So if you just think about the standard kind of penalties, obviously they're not going to be very useful. It's even worse than this. I'll say more about it in a second. The diversity of perceived benefits associated with self-sacrifice sustains many different sources of supply, many different methods of recruitment. We're not dealing with some narrow range of people who are just in it for the money. There's this huge range of things that people are in it for. And if you block one source or one method, firms can readily substitute to others. The Israelis have learned this at great cost and great tragedies. You know, terrorists substitute at every conceivable margin. Initially, the typical terrorist fit a particular profile: young, Muslim, guy, male, carrying around a backpack filled with nails and bombs. But once the Israeli targeted that kind of profile, the opponents substitute. And so you shift to people who are of different ages or gender or appearance, or at least appear to be. And next thing you know, and all of a sudden, the terrorist is dressed up like an Orthodox Jew, or a woman, or a pregnant woman. This is one of the great problems in all military action, that when you target a particular supply, people substitute around it. In fact, and this relates to both of my last 2 points, reducing the rate of suicide bomber success may actually increase the expected benefits for subsequent bombers. Now this sounds a little odd, but think about this. Actions that make successful suicide attacks more costly and difficult tend to increase the status, the fame, the honor, the admiration of the few people who succeed. And there's a similar problem that you're familiar with in the so-called war on drugs. Whenever you limit the supply, to the extent to which you are successful in limiting the supply of drugs into this country, you push up, because it's a market, you push up the price that those drugs get on the street, and you therefore create more incentive than ever for people to supply. And so you've got this vicious cycle. Well, it happens in status markets too. You make it harder to do some crazy thing, and this is even true in your own home with your children or in schoolyards. You make some act that is associated with status more difficult, and there's more status associated with it. So attempts to directly target the supply can actually backfire. And it suggests that we should be focusing more on the demand side. Now, what do I mean by the demand side? Let me just say that careful attention to supply and demand is the hallmark of good economic analysis. And unfortunately, the work that's been done on radical Islam, suicide bombing, religious militancy, extremism in general, has focused mostly on what I'm calling here the supply side. But let's think about firms. Think about these folks as engaged in a business. Normal businesses operate best by specializing. Specialize in the one thing you do best, trade for the rest. Terrorist firms can't do this, thank God. They can't do this because when you go to say, well, look, we're going to specialize in the actual execution of a suicide attack, but let's not get into the business of making explosives. Let's go call up specialists, at the U.S. military or maybe Walmart and say, you got some explosives, I'd like to buy them. Obviously, you can't do this. When you're in the business of producing highly illegal acts, you have to do almost everything in-house. You have to adopt a structure that is more integrated, more vertically integrated, more complex, and bigger than is otherwise efficient. And to avoid detection, you've got to operate through complex, costly, and covert channels. And as I say, thank God, because otherwise it would be a whole lot easier than it is to engage in terrorist acts. This is especially true, as I say, when you're dealing with complex explosive devices, military hardware. You can't just subcontract this. And if you do subcontract, you create other costs because when you work with other people and other organizations, you increase the likelihood of being detected as you communicate with them. You increase the likelihood of defection and betrayal because they're not part of your organization. Vertical integration is characteristic of all kinds of illegal operations. And as I say, it makes things more complicated. On the other hand, if you're one big organization, you're too easy to catch. So we end up with kind of big organizations that are linked together in cells. And again, there's a lot of history here, which I won't go into because it's pretty well known. But cost and complexity, I want to emphasize, are further increased by the need to obtain workers who are willing to kill and die. You can't just hire these people like you do office clerks. They have to be produced, as I said, the sociology of religion shows us, through this social process that involves recruitment and interaction and training. A tremendous amount of effort is required to build commitment, maintain obedience, prevent defection. This does not contradict what I said just minutes ago. It's a social process. It's not a process of finding crazy people or brainwashing people. It's a long social process for the most part. And at every turn, the terrorist firm is threatened from within as much as by without. Large groups often fall prey to infighting, half-hearted free riders. Smaller groups require more outside support, and they're less able to identify and recruit effective martyrs. A profitable market, politically profitable, one that gives you status, influence, in the West Bank, attracts competing groups, and we know all about this, whether it's Hamas fighting PLO or Islamic Jihad. Competition among these groups is characteristic, and the people, surprise, have very little incentive to play fair. And when when competition breaks out, it doesn't usually get resolved in courts of law. So, in many respects, firms that are engaged in radical, illegal, militant activity have it really tough. Not that I sympathize with them, but there are very good reasons why it's hard to pull this off, why they tend to be unstable. And let me mention one more thing. It's especially problematic if you've got incompetent or unreliable workers, which helps explain why suicide bombers tend to be relatively well-educated. We do have data on this. Mentally stable, socially well-adjusted. Even if you could enlist people who are neurotic, ignorant, easily manipulated, the last thing you want is some guy with a death wish and nothing to live for, strapping a bomb onto himself and then offing himself at the meeting rather than, 30 minutes later. You want people who are incredibly reliable, deeply committed, very rational, very smart, able to adapt. You don't want to trust your fate and that of your whole organization to an incompetent dolt, let alone, a partner with a death wish. Religion steps in at this moment. I've just given you sort of the sociological insights why certain sort of processes are needed to attract people, the economic insights why it's actually rather hard to maintain, rather extraordinarily hard to maintain groups like this, and now religion. Because so far I've just talked about this as though it was all my economist friends would call a club, just some sort of association, an unusual club, but just some sort of group that gets together, to do something. You bowl, we bomb. religion plays a key role here. Religion plays a key role here because it is so difficult to establish a successful firm in what I'm calling the market for martyrs. Even though the supply of potential martyrs is actually a good deal greater than you might think. And keep in mind, you don't need 1% of the population to be radicalized. You don't even need 1/10 of the percent of the population. You've got, let's just pick on the Muslims a bit more, but believe me, I could do the same thing with Christians who don't exactly have the world's most pacifist history behind them. You've got millions of people, or 1 million people. Just take 1% of that. Take 1/1000th, and you've got 1,000 people. How many people do you need to cause widespread terrorism? You need maybe 10, 100 to cause widespread terror. You need just a very few people who are willing to kill themselves. But you've got all these problems working against you. How does religion step in to, in effect, solve those problems for those groups? Well, sad to say, religion is good for a lot of things. Religion is good for creating commitment for whole lots of reasons, and most of that commitment can be used for good. That commitment is mostly historically used for good purposes, but it can be used for very pernicious purposes too. Let's look at a couple of the reasons. One, supernaturalism. One of the resources that religion gives you to work with, to create commitment for good or ill, is the afterlife. A faith-based firm that credibly offers immense personal rewards in exchange for death enjoys an obvious advantage over its non-religious competitors. Here's one group saying, bomb for us, and you die. This other group says, bomb for us, and you go to heaven, you are glorified, and you get 72 virgins. There's an obvious difference in the relative appeal of these two groups, okay? But it's too simple to just end the story there, because it turns out that belief in the supernatural is amazingly pervasive. 95% of Americans, 90 to 95%, claim to believe in God or the afterlife or some form of supernatural, and don't look around. I don't know what it's like in Congress, but among academics, they're always sort of trying to judge the average American by themselves, which means that the average American is so far to the left that they can't quite figure out why the communists didn't do better, and is so secular that they can't figure out why anybody goes to church. Don't just look at yourselves. Look at the profiles of Americans, and then especially look at the Middle East. Belief is pervasive. What's not so pervasive is groups that can credibly direct that belief, build it up. You need certain kinds of organizations. Belief is common, but you need certain kind of organization to persuade people that the 72 virgins only come when you bomb, and only come when you bomb for us. Again, stick with this kind of glib example. This is where what I call sectarianism comes in. A suicide bombing firm will naturally seek to ally itself with the type of religious organization that fosters exceptionally strong belief and commitment. And not just any religious group will suffice. The Muslim equivalent of the Unitarians or the PCUSA, Presbyterian Church of America, will not suffice. These are very nice people. They'll sit around talking about the philosophy of Thomas Jefferson or whatever his Islamic counterpart is. These aren't the kind of people who will strap bombs to themselves. They won't even come to church reliably. You can't even persuade these people to chip in to the potluck. They may pay some money, but darn if they're going to sit around wasting 2 or 3 hours of their time cooking chicken. Now, these are nice people. Many of you may be these kind of nice people, but these are not the kind of people who commit themselves wholeheartedly, fully to an organization. The kind of people who do that are the people who we associate with what we call sectarian groups. Don't find yourself a Unitarian. Find a Jehovah's Witness. Find the Amish. Suicide bombing firms are going to find that sectarian groups are uniquely adept at screening out free riders, building commitment, producing collective goods. Economists and sociologists have done a lot of research on these kinds of groups, on what we call sectarian extremism or cults. And despite some lingering doubts, there's a fairly solid consensus that's emerged over the last 20 years, and some of it is through the work I've done, that these groups owe their solidarity and commitment not to irrationality, not to that litany that I started with at the beginning of this talk, but rather to very rational methods of maintaining group solidarity, and in particular methods that impose what we call sacrifice and stigma on the members. Methods that make it costly to be a part of the group. Why does this make sense? Why is it rational? Well, because basically, if it's costly to be a part of a group, and think sports teams, think the Marines, think fraternities, if you must. If it's costly to get in, only committed people will join, okay? You want to screen out half-hearted people. And then once you're in, Think about a commune that's located in the middle of Antelope, Oregon, where the Rajneeshis were years ago. There just isn't anything to do except be a part of the group. If you isolate yourself physically and socially, you become much more interdependent. And it might be quite rational for me to impose these costs on myself, including other costs that isolate me not physically but socially. Funny clothes, unique dietary habits, unusual sexual behavior, the whole list. It might make sense for me to accept these costs, knowing that all of you will accept this cost, and we end up this really tight-knit group. A group where it isn't easy to just wander away, because after all, you've tattooed yourself. You can't just sort of mainstream yourself into American society. You've shaved your head. Yes, I would like that job as a CEO. Yeah, well, and especially you can't do both at the same time. You can't be an active member of the Hare Krishnas and a typical member of society. So what we call sacrifice and stigma in these sectarian groups is very effective for producing tremendous levels of commitment. And this is exactly what a terrorist organization needs. Religious groups confer other benefits. They confer or they involve large social networks. So there may be this core of people, but there's also who are extraordinarily committed, willing to kill themselves, or rather willing to, yes, kill themselves in order to kill others. But there's also this diffuse pyramid of other people. Think a pyramid with the bombers at the top, and then all these other people, sympathizers at other levels. Plug yourself into that kind of a group, and you're in much better shape. You have a natural recruitment process. You get people kind of moving along the way. You don't have to just reach out to a stranger and hope that they don't rat on you. You can sort of be a part of a whole organization that has a whole pathway up to various types of commitment, some of them quite benign, running the soup kitchen, some of them quite pernicious, being a suicide bomber. So religion confers these broad networks. It's not just a special purpose organization. Religion confers legitimacy and a broad social and institutional structure. The typical sect is engaged in a lot of good things, and this is true of Hamas and a great many organizations in the Middle East. It took a long time for Americans to understand that the key to the popularity of many radical groups in the Middle East is not the violence, or not especially the violence, it's all the social services they're providing. And people will say, well, actually, I don't like the violence, but I like all these social services. They're not just making that up. And so if you can plug yourself into a group that's popular because it provides all of that, you, the suicide bombers, you, the militants, are in much better shape. Now, where does this leave us? Okay, take a big, deep breath, and I'm going to conclude here in just a few minutes. It leaves us with a series of policy concepts, sort of ideas toward a less violent future. And let me go back to something I said early on. Lost in a lot of the studies of religious militancy, and especially of suicide bombing, is this crucial fact. Religious extremism almost never leads to violence. There are thousands of sects and cults that flourish in every region of the world and in every religious tradition, and very, very, very few of them turn to crime. Fewer still embrace violence, and virtually none encourage murder or suicide. And systematic, strategic violence, as opposed to just some sort of episodic outbreak, is especially rare. The United States, for example, is home to several thousand different distinct religious organizations. Most of them are Christian, of course, but they also are every other flavor under the sun. And in the past 2 generations, only 2 religious leaders have ordered killings that we know of: Jim Jones of the People's Temple and David Koresh of the Branch Davidians. Only 2 groups have embraced suicide: the People's Temple and a group called Heaven's Gate. The remaining 99.9, probably 99.99% of religious groups are guilty of doing nothing even remotely similar. In contrast, or let me put it this way, the contrast that's most striking then between, the contrast that really deserves our attention here is between the few groups that are violent and the vast majority that aren't. And in particular right now, for obvious reasons, there's a contrast that we need to understand between violent Islamic militancy and non-violent, say, Christian activism. Within the academics, there's a tendency to find, to write books that talk about suicide bombers and then immediately sort of go on in some even-handed way to talking about Christian fundamentalists and the Promise Keepers. I'm sorry, this is not very instructive. And it's demand-side factors that hold the key to the difference. I wish I could say that Christianity or Judaism or any particular religious tradition is just inherently nonviolent, but history shows it ain't so. And let me take one example. Among evangelical Protestants and Orthodox Catholics in America, there are many millions who view the act of abortion as murder. The acceptance of abortion as immoral, the legality of abortion as grossly unjust. Anti-abortion theology is fully developed and routinely preached in churches all over America. Tens of thousands of anti-abortion true believers already devote substantial portions of their time and money to anti-abortion activities. In short, the potential supply of militant anti-abortion martyrs is vast. The actual supply is nil. The number of people who've actually engaged in criminal activities, and especially violent criminal activities related to abortion, is extraordinarily small. Why? It's not because of the psychology. It's not because of the inherent niceness of Christianity. It's because Christian organizations in the United States and in the West have deliberately avoided getting into the business of recruiting and training and launching anti-abortion militants of any kind, let alone anti-abortion suicide bombers. And again, it's not because Christian theology just always is against violence. It reflects contemporary social, legal, economic, political realities. And here's the reality. Any church, any preacher advocating anti-abortion killings, much less planning them, is going to end up in jail. Any church that openly encourages this kind of militancy is going to lose its following, lose its funding, be crushed by the weight of public opinion and law. And as some of my friends from Mercatus say, even if public opinion and law didn't do it, the lawyers would, and the IRS would. Disaster would befall a religious firm that seeks to profit from virtually any form of criminality or violence in America. Where does this leave us? Where does it leave it? It strongly suggests the long-term solution to the problem of suicide bombing and militant religious extremism lies in changing what I'm calling demand-side conditions. Let me suggest a few policies that can undermine the demand for religious militancy. And again, think about the analogy with the problem of the war on drugs. You can fight reducing supply. You can tear up the crops here. You can poison them there. You can go after the leaders here. And surprise, there are 20, 30 other ways to raise those same crops. And if you get all of those crops, there are 20, 30 other drugs that you can supply that are very similar. You go after the supply, and you get almost nowhere. That's the sad truth. How do you undermine demand? Well, here are some ways. And like a good academic, I'm going to end with stuff that's a little vague. I wish I could just say, here's the solution. Obviously, if the solution were like that, we'd have it already. But here at least is the direction of the solution as I see it, or a set of solutions. 1, encourage competing theologies. Militant theology of radicals is most effectively neutralized by competing theologies, which are in turn effectively produced by competing religious groups. Another way of saying that, secular propaganda, and especially secular American propaganda, is going to be extremely ineffective among people who are attached to militant Islamic Middle Eastern ways of thinking. The best way to encourage civility, ironically, in the religious marketplace is to encourage competition. More groups competing with each other tend to compete themselves, and we've got a lot of history on this score, toward more religious civility. Encourage competing groups. Here's another related idea. Encourage competing groups encourage competing groups rather than, and in a sense, trust the market here. I know this sounds like a little Pollyannish. Don't back repression. Don't back, especially civilian, or rather, don't back authoritarian regimes that, in effect, are promising you that in return for your millions and billions of dollars, they will crush the radicals. They will perhaps crush today's radicals, but at the cost of, A, continuing to produce authoritarian regimes that are problematic for all kinds of reasons, continuing to tar America's reputation with people all over the world, and continuing to foment even more discontent and radicalism in their own countries. Encourage competing religious groups, a more open religious marketplace, rather than trying to crush the religious marketplace. We know that this has worked in the United States. We know that this has worked in Europe. I hate to say have some faith, but look at the empirical evidence and consider the possibility that it might also work in the Middle East. work toward a true separation of church and state, including fiscal and legal non-discrimination among denominations. A true open religious marketplace can't be one in which there's a particular religion that is linked directly to the government and given special favors. Separation undermines religious militancy for a lot of reasons, but in particular, it reduces the incentive to kill off your competition so you can be the one church or the one denomination that gets all the benefits from the government. In the United States, unless the Constitution truly falls, there's just no great advantage to being a big religion other than the advantages that come to just being big. Because you can't go to the government and say, hey, we Catholics are 28% of the population. We Baptists are, catching up any moment. Give us, 20% of your tax dollars. Give us M16s. This does not work under a regime of separation of church and state. And finally, foster better provision of basic social services and economic opportunities. Recognize something that I haven't dwelt on, but I sort of implicitly touched on. Recognize that the appeal of sectarian religion is that it produces collective goods. It produces welfare. It produces people who are concerned about each other, but it also produces education. It helps make people safer and healthier. And in the United States, we don't worry about many of these things. We don't normally look to religion to obtain education and safety and health care because we have a vast and well-functioning, relatively well-functioning market and government. It supplies an array of services, and as a result, people don't have to form their own self-help groups for those services. But in the Middle East and in many parts of the world, government is dysfunctional, economies are dysfunctional. Iraq is a very good example. And where do you look? You look to the cult, you look to the sect, you look to the clan for the provision of things that we naturally look to, well, Walmart for. If you build in one way or another, if you enhance and improve the quality of social and economic and governmental services in countries, you tremendously undermine the attraction of these radical religious groups. None of these changes are easy to implement, of course. I'm not saying that you can snap your finger and turn the Middle East into some sort of free market, free enterprise, politically free paradise. But I am saying we can move in the right direction. We can move in relatively simple ways, although they're politically difficult, but simple, conceptually. Free trade with the West, freer trade, is a great way to encourage entrepreneurship and economic growth everywhere. And entrepreneurship and economic growth makes religious radicalism less attractive. We've got a lot of evidence on this. That involves no real intervention in other societies at all. It just involves pulling down barriers on our side. I'm not saying you've got to turn the Middle East, as I say, into a bastion of democracy and capitalism. I am saying that things can be done at the margin that make a big difference. And that, unfortunately, a lot of the things that we've done, not just in the United States, but that we've done and thought about are probably counterproductive in the same way that a lot of our policies and drug wars have been counterproductive. So here's my bottom line, and I'm done in a minute here. Insights from standard economics and the economics of religion help us understand why the martyrdom market can flourish only when numerous exceptional conditions combine. And they suggest that a relatively small number of changes in those conditions can dramatically disrupt the market. It's really a very fragile thing, which is why, thank God, there is so little of it historically and in much of the world, even today. Relatively small changes can disrupt the market. The imperative for us is to understand that market well enough to identify those relatively small changes, find the activities, find the interventions that are likely to reduce reduce cooperation within terrorist firms, encourage defection among members, increase damaging competition, undermine the firm's ability to collect payment for services rendered, and above all, diminish the overall demand for terror as a tool of politics and power and personal advancement. That's the story. Thank you very much.
All right, I think we're about ready to open the floor for questions, but if you could take a moment to fill out the green feedback form, that would be great.
Get a drink. Can you give me some water?
Towards the end, I think, if I heard you right, you kind of recommended free trade as almost a panacea for everything. Can you give me an example where, I think you mentioned Colombia later on in a different context, but
Yeah.
as far as I understand there, the liberalization of the international coffee market, the encouragement of of development of coffee in other places led to a destabilization of the market price, and consequently more coca cultivation, more competition for that, more terrorism, more narco violence. Is there a case you can point to where free trade has led to less terrorism?
Let me try to clarify what I'm saying, because I certainly didn't use the word panacea. Let me talk about the Taliban as an example of the problem. When you look closely at how the Taliban took control of Afghanistan, it's very much an economic process. The Taliban and others, there's always been a substantial market for smuggling going into Pakistan. But when you've got scores of competing sort of clans, they compete with each other and dissipate the profits, so to speak. What Taliban basically did was cartelize the market and would say to warlords, in effect, look, you can fight us, in which case we will, at some cost, attempt to destroy you and probably succeed, or you can become part of the cartel. And in essence, distorted markets creating large profit opportunities were key to sustaining the capacity of the Taliban and a great many other groups to succeed. I hate to point this out because so many people are convinced that it's just a moral imperative to continually limit the supply of drugs. But the problem that you're describing arises because you've got one market which is very heavily controlled and hence very, very profitable for cocaine. If you did this to the market for corn or tobacco, you would have tremendous violence in gangs, producing everything from wheat to tobacco. If you try to free up one part of a market and leave the rest very heavily constrained, you might very well indeed create an incentive for increased cartelization in one part of the in that other part of the market. What I'm talking about, though, particularly in Iraq, is a strategy that says we need to open up economic markets as much as possible. We need to make the average Iraqi have a calculation that simply runs like this. I can devote energy to being part of a radical group, or I can devote energy to running a shop. I can devote energy to economic and political activities that have a payoff. In the United States, all sorts of activities have that payoff. In much of the world, it's remarkable, and it's almost hard for us to conceive how many activities have essentially no payoff, because if I successfully grow more corn or wheat, it gets taken away from me by a coercive government, or the level of violence is so high that that I cannot amass any resources. So basically, I'm saying we need to shift people's incentives, and even small shifts can make a huge difference.
Well, I hear you encouraging people to go into economic activity versus violent insurgency, but...
No, I'm encouraging us to think in terms of ways that we can make economic activity more attractive. And the traditional strategy is sort of first to pacify, create an environment in which economic activity is viable, relatively straightforward. The counterinsurgency, the classic sort of counterinsurgency strategy is to sort of pacify the streets, and then people will begin to turn their hearts and minds toward us. I'm saying We just don't have that luxury because, for the most part, the thing that's keeping the place from being pacified is these incentives that people have or don't have. And I got to say, I mean, from the beginning of the Iraq invasion, the thing that was least emphasized, and I'm not speaking as a government insider, but simply one who's looking at the outside, reading the statements that were being made, the thing that was least emphasized was the importance of changing the nature of the economy. I really kind of expected the Bush administration to announce that after they'd gotten 3 miles beyond the Kuwaiti border, we were going to have the first free trade zone. We don't have anything like. I mean, the Chinese have done a better job of establishing free trade zones in communist China than we have in Iraq, and that's bizarre. It's not that we don't believe in free trade, we don't believe in market economies, but we seem to think that it's a luxury that we can allow ourselves after we've solved this other problem. And I'm saying, no, you won't solve that problem until the people there have faced very different incentives.
Thank you, Doctor. One of the things you mentioned at the beginning was, which was provocative, let's take the data that we have, the massive data we have regarding cults in the United States in the probably 70s, 80s, maybe in the 60s as well, and let's use that and try and apply that.
Yeah.
I would, let me get your reaction to something. It would seem like that would work in the short term at the very least if you don't have any other data, but that you run the risk of making large assumptions regarding cultural norms and imperatives that just don't apply in other places when you do that. Can you respond to that?
Yeah, sure. I'll respond in 2 ways, or several ways. First, I agree that that is exactly what I was recommending, and it's remarkable how little it's been done. And let me just start with the kind of I told you so, not you, but immediately after September 11, there were very few of us who knew something about the sociology of cults and said, what we're hearing from you, what you're claiming to know about these suicide bombers doesn't fit good social science. And at considerable cost and over a great period of time, it has now been established pretty much beyond doubt that the things that the few of us who knew something about cults were saying were right. Number one, these guys aren't poor and desperate. They're not mentally ill. They're recruited. They're not people who first, sort of intellectually change their view of the world and then go find a cult that matches their view. It's the opposite. Social networks are key. So in one sense, my strongest answer to you is we've already learned a great deal, and over and over again, it's affirmed sort of the opposite of your concern. It's affirmed that social science and social phenomena work in very similar ways across these radically different environments. And so the first answer I have to you is, though I couldn't have guaranteed it, all the evidence we've seen so far shows that the analogy is a really good one. Okay? Yeah, there has been a good deal of empirical work, and people, and I find myself thinking, you get into the American Economic Review for this, you get into the American Economic Review, and some very good economists have, I'm not belittling them, for looking at some survey data that's been done in the West Bank and discovering that the most radical people, in terms of their attitudes, are not desperately poor, are not poorly educated. They're middle class. We've gotten very good work. Mark Sageman, I mentioned a couple of times, has retrospectively collected information on suicide bombers because, when these suicide bombers die, part of it is status and glory. So they leave behind a document of videos that tell you a lot about them, and it's not hard once you know who they are to learn more. We now have huge databases on the people who've actually killed themselves. We have a lot of other data from people who didn't. Most suicide bombers fail, actually, it turns out, especially in Israel. We have people we've actually caught, and a number seem to lose their nerve at the last minute. And we know about these people. They are, again, not mentally ill, not poor, they actually, on average, have much better than average for that part of the world, much better than average opportunities. They are people who have everything to live for and, one would guess, are dying for true causes. And if you think this is weird, just think about who are the most effective military recruits. Who do you put in as your crack, commandos who go into very, very dangerous situation? You don't say, let's give them a psychological profile, find the people who are depressed. And you don't say, let's just find people who, seem to be fanatical. You engage in this long process of socialization. Now, why is it that despite these cultural differences, the the predictions have held so well, and why, is there a reason to believe that more study is merited? Well, in part, it's because the studies that I'm talking about already involve a huge array of different cultures. We've got, most of the work was done in the US, but a good deal was done in Europe. Much of it, some of it involved Christian groups. Many involved groups of many different traditions, Asian traditions, some from the Middle East. Some groups that we've studied were secular altogether. They were, communes that were established in the heyday of the hippies. So in a sense, culturally, what we've got is already a vast and diffuse database. And if we worked a little harder, if we directed the kind of money that the federal government has against studies of religious extremism, not necessarily violent kind, but what I mean by extremism is just extreme commitment and distinctive behavior. If we directed it against studies of extremism worldwide, we'd amass very quickly huge databases, and we could look for the intersection. We could indeed begin to identify quite readily what seems to be unique to the United States or the Western or the Christian view of the world. The things that I'm suggesting about social networks and others are already clearly there in virtually every group we've studied. But if we did more work, we'd be more confident, we'd learn more things. The folks who studied cults in the 1970s are a band of 25 poorly paid academics. I know most of them by name. I just can't believe that they've turned up everything there is to know.
Well, if there aren't any more questions, that concludes our session for today.
Looks like there is
I'm
one.
Sorry.
We're all friends here.
We were talking earlier about economics as one of the potential solutions to decreasing the demand for suicide bombers, and yet none of the profile you suggest that none of these people who carry it out are economically depressed. What's the nuance?
What's the linkage? Is that what you're?
Yeah.
Okay, look, I alluded to this. You really have to think about this market as a rather large and complicated market in which the suicide bomber, the person who actually kills himself, and even the cell members are kind of just the tip of the iceberg, okay? And in some ways, the least important part, okay? You can recruit radicals for almost any cause if you have a lot of resources to work with. And I don't mean just monetary, but you can bribe people. But you can also, symbolic resources, data. Where do you get all of those resources, and why are they there? The suicide bombers are part of much larger networks that have political and economic objectives. The simplest and crudest objective is to be sort of the most powerful political figure in the West Bank. And one of the ways to do that, sadly and ironically, is to have a higher kill ratio than other people. So the suicide bomber is truly, in a sense, an employee of a larger firm, and the larger firm has a set of incentives which are political and economic, as we now know, and it's tragic and upsetting. Being Yasser Arafat was an extraordinarily profitable proposition. I mean, literally hundreds of millions of dollars from the United States and Europe were flowing through the PLO's hands, and mostly flowing through Yasser Arafat's hands, and apparently in large amounts are now still in his wife's hands. Those economic incentives are very real, and the political incentives are very real. And so I'm not, when I say we need to change that it would be effective to begin to change the nature of the political and economic situation, it's not just because I'm thinking about that one suicide bomber. I'm thinking about all the religious radicals on the one hand who are, and think of them as bright, capable people, okay? If they go into normal lines of work, they will end up better than average on the West Bank. Well, I'm sorry, they will end up better than their other friends on the West Bank, but they will not distinguish themselves in any great way. They can distinguish themselves by achieving things that give them great political power and status. They can't, in the current environment, become captains of industry. But they could in a rather slightly different environment. Okay? You don't have to be the United States. You can be India and create an environment in which bright people say, I don't want to be a radical. I want to run a business. Okay? So just because you're not poor doesn't mean you don't have incentives to do a lot more. And again, I'm talking partly about the incentives of the radical who straps the bomb on him, but mainly the incentives of the groups around who are sustaining this. If there weren't millions of dollars going into support for these people and social networks that keep it in political networks, the whole thing would collapse overnight. These are not the acts of individuals or even the acts of small clubs who just have nothing better to do. So I think we underestimate how radically different the incentives for somebody, say, in Palestine are today from somebody in India, even someone in India who's a good deal poorer. We need to make the incentives in the Middle East look a little bit more like India. Forget about the United States. Forget about saying it's going to take forever to turn Palestine, or Iraq into France, Europe, the United States. Just make it a little bit more like India, and we will. And I know India has its problems, but make it a little more like India, and we will probably see a huge number of people saying, "No, I'm going to go, I'm going to make something of myself rather than try to tear things down."
In that same vein, would you see one of the big roadblocks to that happening as the vast reserves of oil wealth in those nations, because it allows those countries to essentially neglect the other parts of their economy without real consequence?
Absolutely. I see two things. One, as an economist, I see this almost criminal refusal to understand just how valuable freer trade is with the rest of the world. Yes, I know it's politically costly to do anything at all that hurts wheat farmers in Kansas. I'm not ignorant. But I think if rank and file Americans understood that freer trade, more entrepreneurship, more open markets worldwide had real benefits and might actually contribute to pacifying people who really, really scare them, that in itself would be a big deal. Back up. Make the business about extractables. Yeah, it looks like there's nothing quite so pernicious as a source of wealth that isn't tied to individual entrepreneurship and human capital, because you just have to control that. And yeah, it's a real curse throughout the Middle East. It's a curse where diamonds and other extractables in parts of Africa. It looks like this source of great wealth, but you look at the trends, it's been a source of poverty. And it makes it possible for autocratic governments to be viable when, if there were no such resource, they wouldn't be the least bit viable. And of course, we're seeing it all over the world right now, including in Russia. When people talk about the wealth of Russia, the wealth of the newfound or greatly increased wealth in, whether it's Libya or Venezuela, this isn't wealth. This is just some black stuff in the ground, which is being exchanged for the wealth of the West and the wealth of hardworking people who are, and it makes it so much easier to ignore your own people. You don't have to worry about their human capital. You don't have to worry about their efforts. It's a terrible and tragic thing. And unfortunately, there's no easy way around it, although in energy policies, energy programs that reduce our reliance on oil would certainly help, and which means production of more energy in other ways would certainly help. I think we're over, right? And I thank you again.
All right. Well,
Okay.
thank you for coming.
All right. Take care.